Well, that's not a good question.
Okay, I'll skip it. Where did you live and work during the war?
Most of the time I lived and worked in Norfolk, Virginia and in Richmond, Virginia. However, in 1966, I was transferred to Chicago. So I lived there, and that was kind of key for a story that you may ask me about a little bit later on.
Okay. And then one of my other questions was like, what was the majority job? Like, what was the job that like most
What did
people had?
my job, or what did
just
most
like
people have?
Yeah.
Well, the nation was somewhat divided. I was a white collar worker. That means I got paid by the year, and I never got my hands dirty. Right? The heaviest thing I ever picked up was a pencil, and I had to know certain skills like the use of computers and typing and that sort of thing, because I was a writer, primarily a writer. Prior to that, I was in radio and television for a number of years, but as a young man, I outgrew that. So that's when I joined the public relations team at a major corporation that does not exist anymore. So that was during the war, and they're the ones that transferred me from Richmond to Chicago to New York and then back to Richmond, Virginia. That's where their corporate headquarters was. It was called Reynolds Aluminum. You've heard of Reynolds Wrap? Well, that was one of the products that they made. But maybe 10 years ago, they were bought by Alcoa. So Reynolds Aluminum doesn't exist anymore, but that's a little off subject for you.
How did you feel about the anti-war protests and the counterculture?
I thought that they were, well, you have to remember now, I went to a military college, so I was taught a lot of discipline. I was an Army officer, so I also had a lot of discipline. I'm from the South, and in the South we learned that there are certain rules that you follow, and none of those were compatible with the counterculture, the so-called hippie movement. Now, I said I was in Chicago and that I would come back to that. Now I'll tell you the story why that's important. I was in Chicago in 1968. Actually, I was there 66 through 69, but in 1968 I was there. And that was the time when the Democratic National Convention was held in Chicago to nominate a man named Hubert Humphrey, who was going to run against Richard Nixon. And there was a lot of demonstrations at the Democratic National Convention. You may have heard stories about this where they brought out the National Guard. And they used certain things like tear gas. And Michigan Avenue was, where I worked was on Michigan Avenue. It's called the Wrigley Building. And out my window I could see Illinois National Guard going up and down the streets. And one day I was out having lunch and I got tear gassed.